Welcome, and thank you for letting me join you on your journey to sleep or relaxation. This content is not meant to be listened to by people who are driving, operating heavy machinery, or are expected to be alert and present. The story we'll hear today is titled Yard Work. But first, over the next few minutes, we'll set aside all worries and let go of any tension you may be holding. Find a comfortable position, either seated or lying down. Now, if you're settled and safe, close your eyes and just let your body rest. Take a long, deep breath in. And as you exhale, feel your body begin to relax. Breathe in again, slowly and deeply, and release, letting go of any stress or tightness. And as your breath settles into its natural rhythm, let your attention drift down to your feet. With every exhale, feel your feet growing heavier and sinking deeper into relaxation. Let go of any tension in your toes, your heels, and the soles of your feet. Now, move your focus upward to your legs. And as you breathe, allow your calves, your knees, and your thighs to release any tightness. Feel your legs becoming soft and still, as though they're sinking deeper into the surface beneath you. Next, bring your attention to your hips and your lower back. Imagine a warm wave of relaxation sweeping over this area. And with each breath out, feel any discomfort or tension melting away, leaving your body completely at ease. Now, let's focus on your chest and shoulders. Feel how they rise and fall with your breath. As you exhale, imagine your shoulders softening and dropping, releasing any weight they've been carrying. Your chest feels open and light, with each breath soothing this space. Shift your awareness to your arms, hands, and fingers. Let any tension here dissolve with each exhale. Your arms are loose and your hands soft. there is nothing you need to hold on to. Finally, bring your focus to your neck and face. Notice if there's any tightness here, especially in your jaw or forehead. Let your jaw unclench, your forehead smooth out, and with each breath out, let your entire face soften into relaxation. Your body is now fully relaxed, resting peacefully. Take a moment to notice how your body feels, completely at ease, and let yourself sink deeper into this calm. As you continue to breathe, focus on the air entering and leaving your body. And with each inhale, you are drawing in peace and stillness. And with each exhale, you release any remaining stress, letting it drift away. As we continue with our story, remember this feeling of peace. And now, as promised, our story, Yard Work. I'm a bit of a slob, I admit it. My chores always get done, eventually, but I've never been overly enthusiastic about cleaning or maintenance. Sometimes I don't do my dishes right away. I'm not very good at sorting my recyclables. There are dust bunnies in the corners and clothes thrown about, but I'll get to those too, eventually. My biggest failing was yard work. I sometimes go weeks without cutting the grass or pulling the weeds. The bees need the weeds and the wildflowers, right? No point in cutting them. And there's certainly no reason why the grass needs to be a special length. But looking outside, I could understand why someone might think I don't care at all. And that's certainly not the case. Through the kitchen window, I stared out at my backyard, coffee in hand. My inspection of the state of the lawn found nothing redeeming whatsoever. My yard was fairly simple in terms of shape and features. It was largely square, surrounded by neighbors on all three sides. I had built a small deck off of my back door, and the rest was grass. In fact, the weeds seemed to be engaged in a contest with the grass to see who could grow the tallest before collapsing under its own weight. Uneven tufts of greenery poked through the mesh at the bottom of my chain-link fence, encroaching on the yards of my three neighbors. It was Saturday, my day off work, and despite desperately trying to find a reason to not cut the grass, I had none. Unwilling to do the task without entertainment, I grabbed my earbuds, queued up my like list, and threw on some sneakers. Catching a slight breeze as I walked out the door made me realize there was no reason to complain. It was a beautiful day, warm, sunny, not a cloud in the sky. Standing on my small deck, I took a deep breath and did my best to take in my surroundings fully. After a moment, I hopped off my deck and headed toward the shed through the overgrown mess I had allowed to accumulate. Before I was able to get to my lawnmower, I caught a flash in my peripheral. One of my neighbors, Mr. Harold Parks, was in his yard, waving hello in an attempt to get my attention. Removing my headphones, I headed in his direction. He was an older man, but as far as neighbors go, he was one of my favorites. His direct nature and no-nonsense attitude was sometimes a welcome change. After some brief pleasantries, he motioned to the yard and made a remark about its state. I assured him I was just behind in chores, and that it was my next priority for the day. Making a small grunt-like noise, he placed 2 fingers to his temple, gave a very casual salute, and headed back inside. I took this as a sign that my explanation was sufficient as long as I carried through with the task at hand. Hoping to stay on good terms with Mr. Parks, I decided to trim the boundary between our yards first. I replaced my headphones, grabbed my string trimmer, and began to cut away at the overgrowth between our fences. The familiar sound of the garden tool didn't quite overpower the noise-canceling feature I had enabled, but I could tell it was working when bits of grass began flying in all directions. I made my way down the fence, doing my best to match the cut height of the grass on the other side of the barrier. Harold stood inside, evaluating my work through the window, but I didn't let his presence bother me. I continued down the back portion of my property. The job was going well, and I was ready to start the final side of the backyard when a figure appeared in front of me. My heart settled as I began to recognize the figure as Mrs. Edelman, my other neighbor. She was frantically waving her arms and pointing at her ears, which I interpreted as a request to remove my headphones. I removed the earbuds and asked her if she needed help with something. Apparently, the noise I was making had disturbed her. I patiently reminded her that I was following the HOA's guidelines on noise during weekend hours, and that it had been her who had reported my lack of lawn care to the HOA president. This complaint resulted in an infraction notice posted on my door for the entire neighborhood to see. This notice also served as a final warning before a fine would be given, resulting in a lien if not paid. Seemingly uninterested in the problems she had brought to my life, she continued to explain her responsibilities as the owner and landlord of the property next to mine. She then sharply questioned if I was aware of her status as landlord. I assured her I did, but also that the grass needed to be cut, and I wouldn't be taking much longer. She stormed off in a bit of a huff. It was almost guaranteed that she'd be inside on the phone with all of the local HOA conspirators before her back door could even close. All I could do was chuckle to myself. I didn't want to let someone like Mrs. Edelman ruin this gorgeous day. I trimmed up the last side of the yard and decided to get the rest done as quickly as possible. I had enough interaction with my community members already today. I hauled the larger mower from the shed, fired it up, and began my sweeping pattern. It couldn't have been more than a minute before I was yet again interrupted, keeping me from completing my task. A loud shriek filled my head and made its way down my spine. The lawnmower powered down as I let go of the handle to cover my ears. The noise seemed to echo inside my head, but only for a minute. As quickly as it started, it began to die down, and I was able to regain my composure. I looked around desperately to make sense of what I had just experienced. Mr. Parks still stood at his window, but seemed to have lost interest in my activities. I could also see Mrs. Edelman in her kitchen, pacing back and forth, throwing her hand wildly into the air. I knew she'd be on the phone. Everything seemed to come back to normalcy, and then, as if piercing through all other ambient noises, was a whimper. Confused, I listened as the one voice turned into two, and then maybe four. In a few moments, these weak whimpers enveloped my head and evolved into a cacophony of despair. My head was filled with a mixture of noise and pressure, both of which increased to the point where I fell to my knees. Beginning to think my life was in jeopardy and without any other options at my disposal, I begged whatever it was to stop. When no relief came, I bargained, promising anything. In that moment, the pain and the confusion began to subside. The sound remained, but had begun to soften considerably, morphing into what could only be described as a room of hushed whispers I could barely hear. Pausing, still on my knees, my breath calmed while trying to make sense of the situation. Unable to find a sensible answer, I checked myself for any signs of a serious problem. But I was not dizzy. I had no pain. Everything seemed to be working perfectly, and everything around me was still. There was nothing to give the indication that anyone else had experienced the same thing. Without any other explanation, I assumed it was just some sort of fluke, and decided to continue on with my chores. I leaned forward, stretching my arm out toward the ground to help push myself back to my feet. As my hand made contact with the freshly trimmed grass, the noise began to return in my head. The jolt from the sharp return of this phenomenon startled me and made me fall from a kneeling position onto my back. The noise in my head again ceased almost as quickly as it had started. Unsure of how to proceed, I went to place my hands beside me to push myself upright, but I paused. I had already developed a Pavlovian-type response in fear of having the sensation return. I slowly placed my right hand down, just to the point of grazing the very top of the freshly shorn blades. Feeling no ill effects, I decided to push my luck a little further. With a bit more force, I slowly pushed my hand down further into the shag of the grass, making contact with the cool soil. I was relieved when my condition remained the same. Becoming curious, I conducted the same test with my left hand and was pleasantly surprised when I could do so without suffering. I found myself trying to rationalize the situation and form a reasonable explanation for what I had been experiencing. Considering the options, I arrived at the conclusion that the only reasonable way forward would be to test the patch of grass that had triggered the sensation while I was kneeling. I forced my body back into a kneeling position with the same difficulty as any other aging man. I positioned myself to perform the same action I had earlier, cautiously reaching toward the area where my hand had left an impression. I jumped back when an unsuspecting voice from behind me called out to ask what I was doing. Mr. Parks was back, standing outside with hands on hips and looking in my direction. His voice had pulled me away from my experiment and pulled me out of my inquisitive bewilderment. I assured him that I was fine and was just observing a small bug. He shook his head, mumbled something under his breath, and shuffled his way back inside. After hearing the familiar sound of his screen door slamming shut, I turned my attention back to my experiment. Without hesitation, I reached forward and placed my hand on the grass, compressing it sharply. I immediately pulled my hand back and then again pressed it on the grass, only to find that the noise started and stopped, depending on my action. Touching other patches of grass produced 0 results, despite every fiber of my being telling me it wasn't possible. I couldn't help but conclude it was the grass making the commotion. Not only the grass, but this patch of grass specifically. I felt around on the ground, trying to determine just how much of my grass was affected by this unexplainable issue. Based on a series of pats to the ground, I determined I was only hearing the noise if I touched the grass found in a patch that was about 2 square feet. The curious and somewhat comforting part was, during all of my probing, I could not produce the shrill shrieks I had experienced while moving. As much as I never wanted to hear that noise again, I had to know the truth. I started up the lawnmower and proceeded to cut in my previously established pattern, but immediately got the same result. Cries and screams filled my head, and I stopped immediately. Again, I fell to the ground, but the noise just continued until I once again begged and pleaded with the noise to calm down. I placed my hands on the freshly cut blades and got the overwhelming sensation to help, as if several voices had converged to speak as one. This call for help was accompanied by an immense compulsion to provide care. The noise, or voices, or whatever you want to call it at this point, only calmed down when I promised to help. I decided the best thing I could do for the grass was to give it some food and water. I raced back to my shed and retrieved a pre-mixed bag of fertilizer and a hose. I covered the recently cut area with fertilizer and gave it a quick dose of water. My efforts had started to make a difference. The noises in my head were changing from that of terror to ease and relaxation. I stayed there for a few moments, reflecting on the situation. I assumed for a second that I had not indeed gone crazy, and that my evaluation of the situation was correct. I had to ask myself if these entities were actually alive. All evidence seemed to suggest they were. My confidence in dealing with this entity grew a little, and I brushed my hand over the top of the area I had treated. My head became filled with feelings of joy, happiness, and satisfaction. Perhaps it was the idea of dealing with something novel, or just the absurdity of the situation, but I quickly became attached to this little patch of weirdness. Still needing to get my work done, I tried to devise a method that would allow me to cut around the small patch that was causing me issues and continue with the rest of the lawn. I used my hand probe technique to double-check the boundaries of this odd patch of land. I made a mental note and positioned the lawnmower to avoid cutting the wrong area. However, despite my attentiveness, as soon as the lawnmower blades began to spin, the symphony of screams started again. I quickly shut off the lawnmower and was met with an overwhelming sensation that others were in danger. At first, I couldn't understand this message or what others they were talking about. Communication only seemed to work one way and was based on a series of feelings or intentions rather than direct words. Thinking it meant there were other patches on the ground, I got on my hands and knees and once again began probing the yard. I came to the conclusion the voice was right when I stumbled upon 12 other patches in the yard that responded as my hand made contact. They ranged in size and shape, which was going to make it impossible to cut around them. The most astonishing part was each patch of grass seemed to have its own distinctive, voice. It was never a single voice, but the collection created by the different areas seemed to produce their own unique sound. It was an odd feeling, but I swore it felt like I had just met 13 different people. It was silly. It was just grass. Or at the very least, it looked that way. Regardless of how outlandish my actions felt, I took the lawnmower back to the shed, leaving the bulk of the yard uncut. I gave the entire yard a treatment of fertilizer and some water, and my head was filled with one of the best feelings in my life. I can only describe it as euphoria, the exact opposite of what I had felt earlier. Not sure what to make of the incident, I headed inside and tried to process the whole thing. There was no one I could call, no one I could tell. Even if I did have an expansive social network, who exactly would believe what I had gone through? Without an idea on how to move forward, I went back inside and hopped in the shower. As the water rained down on me, I couldn't help but think of the joyous feeling I got when watering the grass. I thought about how something so simple could be so appreciated and celebrated, which made me reflect on my own feelings and life situation. As sad as it was, that was the best interaction I had with another entity in a long time. Was it wrong to be happy about my new friendships? Was it wrong to help something else out and accept the joy that it brings me? It wasn't traditional, but maybe there was some peace to be found in this situation after all. The rest of the week went well. Every day, after work, I would visit my backyard, and while I couldn't give it fertilizer each time, a little bit of watering was given. In return, the feelings of relief and joy bounced around in my head, and by the end of the week, I could swear I was beginning to feel love. The following Saturday, I found myself in the same position as the week prior, coffee in hand, staring out the backyard window, admiring my new friends. I almost spit my coffee back into my mug when the doorbell rang halfway through a sip. Standing at the door were Mrs. Edelman and our HOA president, who was demanding the grass in the backyard be cut. Not being able to tell them of my situation, but also trying to buy some time, I told them I would get it cut today. Unfortunately, the president claimed that wasn't good enough and barged in with Mrs. Edelman trailing behind. She informed me the grass was going to get cut right now while she watched, or I would be fined. I was stuck. Even a single fine would have put my finances in jeopardy. I slowly led them to the backyard where they remained in place, hands on hips, as I hopped around the yard to my shed. I positioned the lawnmower and begged them one last time to just give me a couple more days. The president denied my request and ordered me to cut the grass. Out of options, I spun up the lawnmower and began cutting. Thousands of voices screamed in pain as the various blades were decapitated and maimed by my hands. The pain I experienced in my head was incomparable to the pain I felt in my heart as I was forced to murder an untold number of innocent people who, like me, just needed a friend. This has been Yard Work. Thank you for letting me join you on your quest to relaxation or sleep. Until next time.